Using arrays will make your life nicer when you have to deal with all kinds of similar type objects. An array is simply a group of items, not really even a group of items as much as a way to reference a group of items. So if you think about, I have an attendance list for the class. That lists your names. It lists them in a particular order. It's usually alphabetical. But I look at that list and I know how many students are on that list. I can find a student. I can say who is the first student on the list, who is the last student on the list, who is my third student on the list. So I have access to that kind of information. And my attendance list is a list of the students. And if you think of each one of you as a class object where we could program it, where you have a name, you have an ID, you have a birth date, you have all the data the college stores on you in your object template. Every student is put into a computer system with all that same information. In that way, every student, we could build a class object, and then we can populate it with each student's unique data. And then I can assemble that list of the students and say, okay, how many are in this class? Boom, it tells me. How many, are present today? I can find out which students are or aren't present. I can do all of that. So when we have all kinds of objects of a similar type, if we store a reference to those objects in an array, it becomes a much easier task to manage all of those objects. So to start that out, what we're going to do is we will go grab car v2's class and we will attach it to our using array start file, but we're going to do it a little bit differently this time. We're going to learn about using the different tabs inside of processing. And what happens when we use the tabs is it helps to organize our code, so we look at it in each tab that we will have across the screen here. If I click here, I can say, hey, I want a new tab. When I add those tabs, it helps to organize it. When I save out my project, what it actually does is it saves the contents of each tab into its own separate file. So it keeps things organized for me. When I look at it on screen, they're that way. So if I look over here on the previous example with classes, I have two classes, then I have my main program. It's a little unwieldy to keep scrolling down through. It'd be nice if they were in separate tabs. So what we can actually do is we'll grab the contents of this and then we'll go into the using arrays and then we'll create a new tab, paste it and save it, and then it will be a happy, glorious time. And we'll see how that works. So what I'm going to do is I need to start out from the line that says class car v2 and go down to the end and copy that. I've copied it. It's on the clipboard. If I go and say new tab, it wants me to provide a name. The name that I provide here should be the name of my class. So because this is going to be car v2, I will name it car v2. Hit OK, get an empty file. At this point, I can choose paste, save, and now if I go and look at what I am working on, I will see inside my array start, there's now a second file. It created this second file as part of what I was working on. So now I have this new file that's been made. Now, these, when we started the afternoon, we called update and display functions. But when you have a function that is part of a class, then the proper terminology is it gets called a method. If you go read programming blogs and go through forums or get books, you will see periodically where it will reference something as a method, or we'll call it a function. And if you're like, well, what's a method? I haven't heard about a method before. A method is just a function, but it's a function that is part of an object or a class. So instead of calling it the update function of car v2, it's the update method of car v2, even though it's a function. It worked as a function before, it works as a function now, it looks the same as a function, it is a function, but when it's inside an object or a class, we refer to it as a method. And that's just a little file away in the back of your brain. When I first heard that distinction, a coder friend, he was explaining things and talking about methods and functions, and it's like, well, then what's a method? I know how to write a function, but what's this method thing you reference? I have no idea, because I didn't use classes much in my programming yet, so I hadn't really hit that point of understanding that distinction. So now I have carv2, and now I want to work with carv2 inside my project. And this is where things are going to get fun. If I want to add carv2 to my project, I want to not just add one. I don't want to add two. I want to add a whole bunch. And we'll figure out how many in a little bit. We'll just type in a number, say like 50, and then just keep adding zeros to it until our program breaks, where it slows down to a frame rate of 1 or something like, oh. And if you see smoke coming out of your computer, maybe then you've exceeded where you should be with it. So the syntax for constructing an array in every programming language is always a little bit different. The one in processing I'm not particularly fond of, but what we have to do is we have to tell it, okay, this is the kind of objects I will put into it. Now, one thing about processing is when you create an array is designed to hold a collection or a group of references to similar kinds of things. So I made reference to like my attendance list. It's holding references to students. I don't have information about the computers or the furniture in the room or the facilities. It's just about the students. So an array is designed to hold references to a similar kind of collection of objects. So in this case, it's all going to be carv2. So we tell processing we're going to stick carv2 objects in our array. And then what we do is we use a notation to tell it that we are creating an array. And we put 2 square brackets. The square brackets are common across many programming languages to reference that this is an array. This is a group of objects. We use square brackets to make it different than, say, parentheses, where we'd have a list of items. When it's square brackets, it says this is an array. So that's a pretty common thing across many languages. So now I need to populate that array. Because right now I just said cars is going to be an array. The cars is my variable name. The square brackets means it will be an array, and that array is going to hold a bunch of carv2 objects. So we kind of read right to left when we're looking at this. So we know the data type going into our array, and then it's going to hold that. Now, to actually create it, what we say is cars is equal to new. And this is, again, we saw new earlier, and we're seeing it again. When we're referencing, we're creating something, then we get to use this word new. And this is the one part that really kind of annoys me about processing is I, once again, have to tell it what kind of object it's going to hold. Now you'll notice that there's an error message, variable must provide dimension expressions or an array initializer. It's being grumpy with me because I didn't tell it how many objects I'm putting in my array. So I want to put in, say, let's start out, we'll just use 5 to begin. I mean, realistically, if our code works, it doesn't matter whether we use 5, 10, 50, 500, 5,000. I mean, all I do is just go up here and start putting zeros on, which is what we'll do once we prove 5 works. But you don't start out with like 50,000, unsure if it's going to work, because that's a good way to like crash everything because it's just asking for trouble. Now, you may be one of those troublemakers that wants to do something like that, and you're welcome to, but I would encourage you to be cautious with that. So we've constructed an array. The array is going to hold 5 objects of the type car v2. So now we need to put those into it. And last week when we talked about loops, the question came, well, what is a scenario that I would actually use the loop for doing something worthwhile? Well, if I only have 5 objects in the array, I could put them in one at a time, and I will demonstrate that. But then if I had 50, you'll realize that's probably a really crappy way of doing it, and we might want to use something like a loop, because anytime we're doing a virtually identical operation over and over and over and over, that's the sign that should be big neon lights flashing in your eyes going, that should be a loop. So if you're doing the same thing where it's just like incrementally you're just changing one value and you just are redoing it over and over and over and over and over, that's a loop. But I will populate this manually first, and then we will look at if I change the 5 to 50, there's no way I would want to do this 50 times. But what I can say is cars 0 is equal to new car v2. This. Now, the square brackets, again, square brackets are all about when we're talking arrays, we use square brackets. So I say I want to put an instance of my car object in the first position in my array. Now, an array is a computer construct, and computers don't start counting from the number 1. Computers always start counting with 0. So the first object is at position 0 in my array. So now I have my first object there. Then I can say cars 1 is equal to a new car v2. And I'm already hating that I'm even doing this 5 times. Cars 2 is equal to a new car v2. Cars 3, as you can see, I'm losing motivation very quickly here. v2. So when your homework is going to be to do this for 1,000 objects, you'll probably decide that this is not the way you want to do that. So now I've populated my array with these cars. Now I could go into my draw function. I could now tell each one of those cars to update and each one of those cars to display, and really start hating what I'm doing here. I'm just going to do one just to prove that so far things are running, and then we're going to learn how to do it better. So if I say cars 0 dot update, cars 0 dot display, now we will see how we can use loops as a way to do this much easier. So instead of doing this the hard way, we'll do it the easy way. And this is where we end up using a for loop. Now, remembering on a for loop, there are 3 elements. We have our incrementer. In this case, it'll be the letter I. We have our value that determines how many times the loop is going to run. Now, one thing about arrays is one of the properties we have access to with an array, and cars is our array, is one of their properties is how long they are, how many elements they contain. In this case, it's 5, so we can reference that value. And then we just simply say I++. And now I'll just need to do something inside this loop. So this is how we say for, and then our incrementer, int I equals 0. Then we say I is less than cars.length. And there's semicolons between these 2 elements. Length is the property of an array of how many elements it contains. And now this is where we move into the fun part. We just say car square bracket I close square bracket is equal to a new car v2. And I don't even need those previous lines. So now, instead of needing 5 lines to create my 5 cars, I'm going to use this for loop to make my 5 cars, and it really only is needing now 1 line of code. So each time the loop runs, it starts out I is 0, so car 0 is equal to a new car. Then I goes up by 1. Then it becomes car 1 is equal to it. Cars 1 is equal to a new car. Then cars 2, car 3, car 4. And then the next time I is 5. 5 is not less than the length of how many cars, because there is 5. 5 is not less than 5, so the loop stops running. So this loop recreates these next 5 lines of code for me. Which 5 lines of code, is a pain, but it's not insurmountable. But if my 5 suddenly became 50 or 500 or 5,000, this is a better way of doing it. Now the next trick is we need to use the same for loop in our draw function, but instead of creating a new car, we're going to tell cars I to update and cars I to display. So I can comment some stuff out, copy some code, paste some code, and then just say cars I dot update, cars I dot display. And now this will make all 5 show up, and just because I'm feeling brave, I'll add an extra 0 into it, hit go, and now I have 50 cars. And because it works, I'm getting rid of the code I don't need anymore to show you how little it takes to get my 500 cars animating on screen. Once we have our car class, actually using it takes very little effort on our part.